In this video, we're going to explore 5 very simple yet very effective serger techniques that you definitely need to know. Those techniques being a rolled hem, a flatlock seam, how to gather on a serger, how to do a blind hem, and how to set up your serger for a 3-thread seam. Now you can see that this video is on the longer side, and that's because we're gonna go step by step. We will dive into setup, into problem solving, as well as understanding the technique and examples of practical application, so that way you know exactly where to use it. The first technique is probably one of my favorites and the one that I use quite often, and that is a rolled hem. Let's go ahead and start by setting up our machine. We're going to start by removing the stitch finger. There it is, and then also removing the left needle. All of these steps are usually outlined in a user's manual that came together with your serger. So if you're just not sure what goes where, definitely check it, because your serger might also be very different than mine. And I always keep my manuals handy so that way I can reference them when I need them. Next, I'm going to thread my serger. And here you don't have to use all 3 threads of the same color. In fact, the only thread that you're going to mostly see on your napkins is the one that's going to go in your upper looper. So I'm going to use 3 different colors, and we're going to thread our right needle, upper and lower looper. Now I'm going to thread my serger just like I normally would. Next, we're going to adjust a few settings that we have here on these knobs. First is going to be the stitch length. Currently it's set on 3 for normal serging, so I'm going to turn it all the way to R. My differential feet is going to stay as is, set for normal serging at 1. And I'm also going to leave my stitch width as is as well, set for 5. The last setting that we will need to adjust is the tension. Now here is where partially that magic of a rolled hem really happens. So we're going to leave our right needle as is at 4. We're not adjusting left needle because we have removed it. Now my right needle and left needle are usually set at 4 for regular serging, so I'm going to leave it at 4 as is. But depending on the fabric, you might need to adjust that. So take these settings as a guideline, but as I mentioned, depending on the fabric and the thread that you're using, you might need to play around a little bit with these settings. Now for the upper looper, you might want to leave it as is at 4, or perhaps you might want to loosen it up a little bit. Let's say I'll go down to 3. Now the lower looper, you actually want to increase the tension. As I mentioned, the upper looper thread is the one that you're going to be seeing wrapped around the edge of your napkin. So what happens is that the lower looper actually pulls the upper looper thread all the way around the cut edge, creating that rolled hem. After I have set up my serger, it's time to give it a test run. And here, I like to use the same fabric scraps as the main fabric for the project, so that way I know for sure that the settings are going to work really well. I'm simply going to place a little fabric scrap underneath the presser foot and start serging. And this is what we have. As you can see, the spacing between the stitches is really tight, and that bright green thread loops the edge of the fabric all the way from right side of the fabric to the wrong side of the fabric. Now over here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it doesn't loop all the way to the bottom. So perhaps I can tighten the lower looper just a tad more, so that way it really comes all the way here. So instead of going for 6, I might tighten up to number 7. Let's give it another go on the other side. Now from the right side of the fabric, you can't really see much difference, but if you turn it around, you can really see that the bottom one is a little looser and the top one is a little tighter, and that's the one that we just did, so I'm going to stick to those settings. Now personally, I really like using this technique on anything that's medium weight to lightweight. So fabrics like medium weight and lightweight cotton, silk is a really good one, rayon. And from what I've observed is that the lighter is the fabric, the easier for serger is to roll the edge around it, and the tighter it becomes. Here I've picked up this quilting cotton from the fabric store and cut into squares 13 inches by 13 inches, but you can of course choose your own measurements. Here's my napkin, and I'm actually going to start at the very corner. Now, some people like starting in the middle of the napkin. I personally like starting in the corner, but do a couple of practice runs so that way you can determine what really works for you. Let's go ahead, lift up the presser foot, place the napkin right there at the very tip of the needle, and start serging. Now, don't be afraid to stop if you need to. Don't feel like you have to complete an entire hem in one go. And notice that I'm cutting off with my knife just the tiniest bit of the fabric. You don't want to cut too much, otherwise your corners are going to come out a little bit funny looking. Now, once I'm getting closer to the bottom, I want to make sure that I serge almost all the way to the bottom of the napkin, leaving just enough space for about 1 stitch. Let me get up here real close and mark it with a heat erasable pen. Now I'm going to sew all the way, stopping at that line. And here on your serger, you have a little window where you can see how your stitching is formed, so you can definitely see when you're approaching that line. Once I'm there, I've stopped, I will lift up my needle and my presser foot. I will go ahead and tug my project just a tiny bit, so that way I can turn it around like so. But now what I've done, I've actually pulled the threads, so if I start serging right now, they will be forming little loops at the very corner. So in order to avoid that, let's go ahead and tug those threads up. So that way we return them to the previous tension for a normal stitch. Lower your presser foot and make sure that you position your corners so that way the needle starts right at the top, and start serging again. Once you're at the bottom of the other corner, let's go ahead and repeat all of the steps. Once you're ready to finish your napkin, just go ahead and serge all the way down by cutting off this little tail. Once done, I usually like to separate the serger tail into the threads so that way I can tie them in knots, and then thread them into sewing needle and tuck the ends into the seam. Now let's explore a little bit further. First, let's try and do a rolled hem on a shape, like for example a heart in this instance. Then we'll do one on viscose, then we'll do one on a knit, then we'll move on to cotton voile and finish up with silk organza. I'm going to start right over here. On the curve, I find that it helps if I stop, then lift up the presser foot and then readjust my shape and then keep going. Now when I get to the dip of the heart, I do exactly the same thing as I did for the corners of the napkins. The only difference here is that I leave the needle in and then I pivot the entire shape. I also find that at times it might be a little bit challenging going around the curves when the knife or the blade of the serger is still engaged. So if you feel that's the same for you, you can take a look in your manual and see if you can disengage the blade. And here's the heart. I could have done a little bit better on this curve, but overall you get the principle. Next, let's go ahead and do the edge of this viscose. As you can see, it's very soft and very drapey, and I actually made a pair of pants for summer out of this fabric. To get started, I'm going to use all of the same settings as we did for our rolled napkins. And here's the result. Now it just so happened that the same settings worked for this fabric as well, but let me show you what happens when one of the tensions is off. Now this is what happened when the upper looper tension was too loose, and now you can compare it side by side with a regular looking rolled hem. Now this is what happened when the upper looper tension was too tight. At a first glance everything looks as normal, but if we take a look a little closer, you can see that the bright green thread doesn't loop all the way around the fabric. Instead it stops right here on the edge. You can see it a little bit better if we compare a normal rolled hem with the one that we have here on the top. And you can see there's a tiny little edge over here. And if we turn it to the wrong side here, you can really see what's happening. On the bottom, the bright green thread loops almost all the way to the fabric. And on the top, it stops right here. And instead on the bottom, you can see all of the other threads, which should be nearly invisible. Next, let's go ahead and do our rolled hem on a t-shirting knit. I personally find a rolled hem on knits a little challenging unless you want that sort of rolled effect of a lettuce hem, which we're going to be talking about and exploring in the next serger video. Next, let's do a rolled hem on this cotton voile. As I mentioned before, I find that the lighter is the fabric, the tighter and neater the rolled hem tends to be. Last fabric that we're going to do is the silk organza. As in all previous examples, I also started here by using the same settings as I did for the rolled napkins. And as you can see, it was a total disaster. Now to finally get a normal result, I had to change 5 things. Number 1, tension. So I did up the tension on the upper looper, so it was originally on 3, so I brought it up to 4, and I decreased the tension on the lower looper, so instead of being at 7, I brought it down to 6. Then I also made a wider seam, so instead of being at 5, it was now at 6. I also decreased the differential feed from 1 to 0.7, and finally I also changed the needle to a smaller one. Now it didn't come quite as easy as it might seem. In fact, I had to finagle for quite some time and do a ton of little samples in order to arrive at the result that I was going for. So please don't feel discouraged if something doesn't happen from the first try. A lot of trial and error definitely will build up that serging muscle. Now over the years, I've gotten a couple of interesting questions from you, my dear sewing friends, when it comes to a rolled hem. So right now, I would like to tackle a couple of them. One of the questions was, what if instead of removing the left needle, we actually remove the right needle? And I do have a hands-on example over here. The main difference is in the width of the stitch because one needle is closer to the edge than the other. But I've also noticed that with a wider hem, which was created by removing the right needle instead of the left one, I really struggled creating neat corners. Other than that, it seems like a good variation of the same technique. Another question that I often see is regarding the thread. Now, all of the thread that I use here is polyester thread for serger, but one of the suggestions out there is to use a woolly nylon in your upper looper for better result. Now here I must add that I use regular polyester serger thread for 99% of everything that I do on my serger. So all of the examples that you saw today were completed with exactly the same thread as I would use for a 3-thread or 4-thread regular serger seam. I also get asked how durable is this rolled hem, and I must say I love it. I haven't had any problems with it. I make clothes for myself and for my little one, and everything has survived. And as you know, kids can be a little rough on their clothes, and everything has been great. If I ever have a suspicion that maybe this fabric might be too loosely woven or too soft for a rolled hem like this, I make a little sample, and then I use my nails and I sort of try to pull away the rolled hem edge that I've created. And if it does come apart, then I either have to problem solve and troubleshoot, or perhaps it's not the right technique for this particular fabric. Now let me share with you a couple of examples where I use rolled hem when I'm sewing clothes. This list, of course, just only scratches the surface of the possibilities, but I usually use rolled hem on lightweight sleeves, short and long, then of course on ruffles and hems of any kind for the dresses and for the skirts, but I also often use rolled hem in order to finish the insides of the garments, like for example seam allowances on lightweight and see-through fabrics. Next up we have a flatlock seam. It is a double-sided technique that can be used in many ways, from hemming a garment to piecing fabric together. Now the reason why this technique is called a flatlock seam is pretty much in the name, is because after everything is done and you pull your pattern pieces apart after completing the flatlock seam, everything will be flat, which is really great for reducing bulk in garments like, for example, athletic wear or athleisure, where you really want to minimize the thickness that gets created by a regular seam allowance. Now you can also use this technique in order to add a decorative touch to your garments. Now this is a 3-thread technique on my serger, but as always I do encourage you to grab your serger manual so that way you know exactly what settings to apply to your particular make and model. As for the thread, when you practice it's really great to have different color thread so that way you can see exactly what's going on. Now the first step is to remove one of the needles, and in this technique you can remove the left needle in order to get a narrower seam, or you can remove the right needle in order to get a seam that's a little bit wider. This is also a double-sided technique, meaning you can choose which side of the seam you would like to see on the right side of the garment. From here, you will also make a decision how you're going to thread your serger. So if you want this side, I call it the ladder, to be seen on the right side of the fabric, then you're going to thread your dominant color into your needle. If you want the other side, I call it the snake, to be seen, then you're going to thread the main color into your upper looper. You can of course choose all 3 colors to be the same as well, and then complete threading of the serger as per usual. Now let's go ahead and talk about the tension, which of course is a place where a lot of that magic of this technique is going to happen. Here we have sort of this dance between the needle tension and the lower looper tension. So you will want to loosen up, so decrease the tension of the needle, whichever one you're using, and you will want to up or tighten up the tension of your lower looper. The lower looper will pull the needle thread across the back, and then once you pull your fabric pieces apart, that will create that flat lock seam. First, I'm going to follow the suggestions in my manual. So for my left needle, the one that I left in, I'm going to turn my tension all the way down to 1. For my right needle, I will leave it as is because that's the needle that I took out. For my upper looper, I'm going to leave it at 4 as it is for right now. And for my lower looper, let's go ahead and turn it up to 7. As for the stitch width, stitch length, and differential feed, everything is going to stay as is for regular serging. When it comes to different fabrics, I find that this particular technique actually works well on a wide range of knits. I would say medium weight, medium to heavy weight, but nothing too lightweight. So I do like using it on fluffy fleece and sweater knits, like in this example. I also find that it works really well on t-shirt knits. And perhaps one of my favorite fabrics to use it on is French terry. So we're going to use these 2 little pieces as our test sample. I'm going to place my fabric right sides together, but remember that this technique is double-sided, so you can choose which side of the seam you would like to see. Next, I'm going to lift up my presser foot, lift up my needle, place my fabric right underneath, lower my presser foot, and start serging. Once done, this is what we're going to have. We will need to play around with tension just a little bit, but basically on one side you're going to see the green snake, which was the upper looper thread. Then on the bottom you're going to see almost a straight line of the orange thread, which was the needle thread. And here on the rib of the fabric you're going to see almost a straight line formed by the navy blue thread, which was the lower looper thread. And when we turn the fabric to the other side, you should see an orange zigzag, which is formed by one of your needle threads. The real moment of truth, however, is when we pull this apart and see how it looks. On one side we see the ladder, and on the other side we see the snake, and this could actually do pretty well. But if I look a little bit closer right here on the wrong side of the fabric, I can see that I could perhaps loosen up the tension of the upper looper and on the needle just a little bit more, so that way this side lays a little bit flatter against the fabric itself. A good rule of thumb would be to start adjusting just one of the values. So let's go ahead and lower the tension of the needle from 1 down to 0 and give it a go. The result is good, but I still feel that I could get the seam allowance a little bit closer to the main fabric. So I'm going to lower the tension of the upper looper from 4 all the way down to 3. Alright, here's the moment of truth after pulling it apart. So the latter side looks nearly identical on both, but if we turn it to the other side and we'll look at that little spot right over here, you can see that on the new sample we see a lot less of the orange thread, and the seam allowance itself sits a little bit closer to the fabric. You can then use this in order to construct a seam or to hem a garment, which is my favorite use of this technique. I prefer doing this while the garment or the pattern piece is still flat, and the steps here are going to be very similar to a blind hem technique. So first, of course, we're going to fold the hem to the wrong side of the fabric and then give it a good press. Once done, let's go ahead and turn it upside down and fold the hem just like you see me do on your screen, creating a little sandwich. That's how we're going to take it to the serger. When you're ready, go ahead and disengage the knife so that way you don't cut off any fabric by accident. And then let's start serging. After getting the hem done, I will continue working on my garment. And one of the reasons why I like doing this flat versus in the round is because then I can get a really clean connection point when I sew this all together. Because if you're doing this in the round, my particular serger has a little bit of a trouble going over those layers of seams when they meet at the side. You can see it very well here how the stitching gets a little bit irregular. If you want the other side of the seam to be seen on the right side of the fabric, then we're going to start by folding everything exactly the same way, giving it a really good press, but then instead of folding it like so, we're actually going to fold it like this. Now, this side is going to go underneath the serger. Once done, you're going to see the snake on the right side of the fabric and the lather on the inside. To add a little bit more pop to this technique, you can actually purchase variegated thread or swirly thread, which has multiple colors on one thread, and then it looks really cool, especially for the fabrics when there's a really bright pattern and you're just not sure which color to pick to show through on the right side of the fabric. Technique number 3 can be a real game changer for those of you who really hate gathering fabric on a sewing machine. There are actually 3 ways that you can do it on a serger. The first one would be using the tension dials and a differential feed adjustment. The second one would be doing it manually by pulling one of the threads. And the third one would be by using a specialty foot. Today we're going to explore 2 methods out of the 3 that I mentioned. Those are the simplest ones that don't require anything extra like a specialty foot. First, I find it really useful if you thread your serger with colorful thread, because that way you can see which thread is responsible for what, and then of course grab a big pile of fabric scraps to practice on. And then in this technique, we're not going to be touching any needles. We're also not going to be removing a stitch finger. We are, however, going to play with tension over here and with differential feed, which is the one that we're going to start with. Now, differential feed is responsible for how evenly or unevenly these 2 feed dogs will push the fabric through your serger. Your knob might be located somewhere else on your serger, so definitely take a look in your manual. But a lot of times these knobs will also feature little markings to help us sort of remember what setting does what. So here you see if I push it to number 2, then it will gather fabric. 1 is the sort of standard setting for regular serging, and if I lower it to 0.7, you can see the marking indicates that the fabric is going to be stretched. In this case, as you might have guessed, we want it to be on number 2. If you're only going to adjust differential feed but leave everything else as is, you're only going to get very, very soft gathers that are most likely going to disappear as soon as you stretch the fabric. So let's take a look. This technique is great when you need to ease one pattern piece into another, like for example a sleeve, or when you're sewing with a really stretchy knit. This will prevent those wavy seams. In order to get more pronounced gathering, we also need to adjust the tension on the needles. So let's crank it up all the way up to 6 on the left and on the right needle and give it another try. As you can see, big difference between just the differential feed and the combination between differential feed and needle tension. If we crank up the needle tension all the way up to 8, it will gather the fabric even more, as you see in this example. All of these fabric scraps have been cut to the exact same length. And you can see the difference between all 3 tries. After you're done gathering with the serger, you can use your fingers to evenly adjust gathers and redistribute to make sure that it all looks just the way you want it. If for whatever reason you're a little bit hesitant to adjust tension dials on your serger, you can still gather using the second method. It's basically the manual version of the first one, where you're going to be actually pulling on one of the threads. First, you're going to serge your piece of fabric with a regular tension and a regular differential feed. After that, just like on your sewing machine, we're going to pull on the needle threads. Now I find that pulling on both of the needle threads, the orange and yellow one in my case, is a little bit difficult. So if you pull just on one, it goes a little bit easier. As a result, you're going to gather your fabric, but take a look, it really distorts the entire seam and the edge of the fabric. Now, when it comes to the projects where you can use this technique, I think it's pretty much a no-brainer, because anytime you need to gather fabric or lots of it, you can definitely use your serger to do it easily and very quickly. But let me share with you a couple of projects that I've been working on lately. Here I'm working on a little dress where this piece of fabric is going to become skirt after it's gathered, and I need to fit it into the bottom of this top. And oftentimes I get asked, how do you know what settings to use on your serger in order to gather the exact amount? And of course you can guess, or I can offer you a very simple math method to use. First, I like to cut a piece of fabric of the same that you're using that is 10 inches or 10 centimeters long. Using round numbers definitely helps. Then we're going to measure the length to which we need to gather this fabric. So in this case, it needs to match the bottom of this t-shirt. From here all the way around, it is 28 inches. So I wrote this down, that's what we need. Next, we're going to measure what we have and what we're working with. And here it's 25 inches. It's 2 layers, so that is 50 inches. And as you have noticed, I like to gather when the side seam isn't sewn just yet, because that is way easier. So I wrote it down that this is what we have. Now 50 minus 28 is 22. That's the amount by which we need to decrease the width of my skirt. And you can use the same process for inches and centimeters, it really doesn't matter. Now let's grab our little scrap piece of fabric. I'm going to crank up the needle tension all the way up to 6. Now this is what we have. We know that we have started with 10 inches, a round number. Now we need to measure what we have gathered it to. In my case, the new total equals to about 6 inches. So 10 minus 6 will be 4. There are 5 tens in 50, so I'm going to take 4 and multiply by 5, which is going to give me 20, which is close enough to the total amount that we need to reduce. If this amount would have been way less, then I would have needed to increase the tension. If this amount would have been way more, then I would need to decrease the tension of the needles. As a rule of thumb, I do find it easier to let out the gathers if needed. So instead of cranking it up to 6, I'm actually going to set my needle tension at 7. Once I'm done, as expected, I need to let out the gathers just a little bit. For that, make sure that you leave a decent enough serger tail. Now all that is left to do is sew the side seam and then of course attach the skirt to the top. Here's another example of a little dress that I was working on. The ruffle on the bottom is attached using exactly the same method. As a quick reminder, you can use this method on both fabric types, knits and wovens. And if you find yourself gathering a really thick fabric, you might want to increase the width of the stitch. That really helps me a lot. Next simple technique on the list is a blind hem done on a serger. Now before we get started with the technique itself, we will need to find a blind hem foot that is going to look like this. Now some sergers come with it together at the time of the purchase, and I must say that my serger is definitely on a simpler, on a cheaper side, and it already came with this foot. So definitely take a look through the accessories that came together with your serger. Once you have it, let's go ahead and switch it out. It is super easy. Right here in the back of your presser foot, there's going to be a little lever. So go ahead and press it. This will drop the current presser foot. Now take your blind hem foot, place it underneath, and snap it in place. Now you can actually do a blind hem on your serger by using your regular presser foot. It is a little bit more challenging, but we are going to take a quick look at it a little bit later in the video. Now let's talk about the settings. This is a 3-thread technique, so we're going to start by removing the right needle. Now the stitch finger and the knife are going to stay as they are. The stitch width, stitch length, and differential feed are going to be set all for regular standard serging. So for me, stitch width is set at 5, stitch length is set at 3, and differential feed is at 1. Next, we're going to thread it. Left needle, upper looper, and lower looper. And I am using different color thread so that way we can see the process a little bit better. The tension settings here are going to be somewhat similar to a flatlock seam. And we're going to start with our left needle. Here we need to loosen up the tension. So we're going to bring it down. Let's go all the way to number 2. Moving on to the right needle, here we don't need to adjust anything because that's the needle that we removed. And then let's move on to the upper looper, and we're going to tighten it up just by a little bit. Let's set it up to number 5. And then the lower looper, which we're going to loosen up as well. So let's bring it down to number 3. Now, although this technique is very simple, it does require a good amount of practice, so I like to use my fabric scraps for that. And remember that you can use both your knits and your wovens. I have plenty of quilting cotton scraps, so that's what I'll be using for tests. Now first, place your fabric wrong side up and then press the hem depending on how deep you want it. Next, we're going to fold it down to create a little lip that stands out. These are exactly the same steps for a blind hem as you would do them for a sewing machine technique. Please note that currently the distance between the metal part of the foot and the plastic guide is about 1/16 of an inch. Now you can always adjust it and make it smaller or make it bigger. I find that this width really determines how visible are going to be the stitches on the blind hem that you're going to make. To start working on your hem, we're going to place it underneath our presser foot so that the plastic edge, the little guide, aligns with the folded edge of our hem. As we work through it, you will see a couple of things. First, the majority of the stitches are going to be formed on this little lip that is sticking out. Then the knife is going to cut off any excess that we don't need. Now, the only place where the stitches are going to be formed on this part is the distance between this metal piece and the plastic piece, right over here. I find that there are two ways how you control how the stitches are formed. Number one, you can look right over here and make sure that this folded edge is always butted against this plastic piece. Or number two, you can look through this little window right over here and make sure that the left needle thread only ever so slightly catches the folded edge. This is what you're going to have on the wrong side once you're done. To completely form your blind hem, you're going to open this up and straighten it out. This is obviously way too visible for a blind hem, but for demonstration purposes, this actually works out. And as you can see, the red thread, the one that's in the left needle, is the one that you will be able to see. So that is the one that you will need to match to the overall color of your fabric. On the wrong side, we can see a stitch that is a little bit too loose. So here I see the red thread poking through and forming a loop. So I think I will actually need to tighten up the left needle, and perhaps I will also need to tighten up the upper looper. So let's do one adjustment at a time, starting with the left needle, and do another test run. So I'm bringing up the tension of the left needle up to 3. The sample is done, so let's take a look. Let's pop it open. Oh, and you can definitely see that the red thread isn't looping up anymore. Let me bring the other sample so that way you can see them side by side. There is one thing that I noticed about this new sample, and if we look a little closer, we can see that it doesn't sit quite flat. So it sort of dips a little bit right where the stitches are being formed, even after pressing it. Now, if we take a look on the back, we can see that the lower looper is a little too loose. So initially, I thought that I would need to adjust the upper looper, but the lower looper is actually the one that pulls on the needle thread, and I think it's a little too loose, so I will go ahead and tighten up the tension. So I'm going to bring the lower looper from 3 to 4. And I think we have a winner! On the top, you can see the first sample where we adjusted only the left needle's tension. And on the bottom, you can see the sample that I just did where we adjusted both the left needle's tension and the lower looper. And you can definitely tell that it's much flatter. The last adjustment is to decrease the distance between the metal part and the plastic part, so that way our blind hem stitches can be as small as possible. Now this is a sample with the original width, and these are samples with decreased width. And as you can see, the stitches are still visible, but it's probably the smallest that I can get it to be. To do this without a blind hem foot, you're going to follow all of the same steps, but you will need to manually see that the left needle only catches the very edge of this fold. There is a little window right over here where you can see how those stitches are formed and where they fall. Now let's say you're working on hemming a pant leg or a sleeve, then a lot of the sergers have a removable piece over here, so that way you can place your project over it and hem in the round. And although I really love using my serger for a lot of different techniques, as you have seen from this video, from all of the previous garments, I love playing around with it. This particular technique is definitely not my favorite. I personally barely ever, if at all, use it. And I think it has to do with a couple of things. And one of them is that I find it really difficult to look through that little window of the blind hem foot on a serger to make sure that the stitches are all nice and even and that the blind hem is truly going to be blind hem. And I think that doing a blind hem on a sewing machine or by hand gives a much better result. But remember, that's just my personal opinion, so definitely give this technique a try. Perhaps you're going to love it and find it really useful. Technique number 5 is a 3-thread overlock seam. As mentioned, this is a 3-thread technique, and for that we will need to remove one of the needles and one of the cones that corresponds with that needle. That is going to be our first setting adjustment. Now, if you remove the needle on the right, you will have a wider seam. But if you remove the needle on the left, as you can see, the seam now is narrow. With that, you can choose which setting suits your project the best. The settings for stitch width, stitch length, and differential feed are going to stay the same as they would for regular serging. As always, I'm going to use different colors of thread so that way we can see a little bit better. And with that, our next step is to thread the serger. The tension on the loopers and on the left needle, since I removed the needle on the right, is going to stay the same as for regular 4-thread serging, and mine is usually set all for 4s, so that's what I'm going to keep it at. Alright, now let's grab a couple of remnants of both knits and wovens and do a couple of test runs. We can start by chaining off a little tail. Then lift up the presser foot. Grab your piece of fabric, place it underneath, and lower your presser foot. And let's start serging. We want the seam to be nice and flat without any of the threads pulling to the back or to the front and distorting the fabric. On knits, this seam will remain stretchy, and on wovens, it does finish the raw edges of the fabric with a little bit less bulk than a 4-thread serging technique. If your seam is looking like this, then the color thread that we used is going to help you to identify which thread is pulling. In this case, it's the upper looper that is too tight, and therefore you will need to loosen it. When you're troubleshooting, make sure that you adjust a single setting at a time and then do a test run, so that way you can clearly identify where is the issue. When you're problem solving, here's a quick reminder that tension isn't always the only culprit. Regularly check your serger needles to make sure that they aren't bent, like in this example, or that they don't have any burrs or snipped off points like in this one. Now, one of the questions that I get is, what's the actual difference between a 4-thread and a 3-thread overlock or serger seam? And since I made a couple of samples, let's go ahead and take a look. On the top, you can see 4 threads, and on the bottom, 3. When done on knits, both of these are going to remain stretchy, but the 3-thread one is going to be a little bit stretchier due to the lack of that 4th thread. That also makes it a little less secure. Therefore, you will see oftentimes that a 3-thread technique is recommended on the seams that aren't going to be under a lot of stress or simply to finish the raw edges of the fabric where another seam or another technique is used to construct the garment. Personally, I don't really happen to use it that often, although it is a very useful, simple, but very useful technique to know and to master, especially if you're working a lot with lightweight fabrics like, for example, cotton voile.